it is Coach Ange, and it's hard to believe that we are here with episode 1 for season 3 of A Little Perspective. It was such a fun season. We focused on a huge variety of individuals telling their own stories about their experiences with different kinds of disabilities and conditions. This season, we get to kick it up a notch, and we are talking to some real powerhouses. And man, we are starting the season off right with one of my favorites. Joe and I have been Facebook friends for a little while, and he really, really blows me away and keeps me informed and really motivated to be the best advocate and ally I can be. Samyuktha, can you believe season 3 starting? How are ya?
I'm doing great, and I'm also super excited for season 3. We, like you said, we have such incredible, really impressive people in our show lined up to be interviewed this season. So I'm definitely excited. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest of season 3, A Little Perspective. Please welcome Mr. Joe Stramondo. Go ahead, Joe, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. That's a very warm and generous welcome, and I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Joe Stramondo. As my day job, I work as a professor at San Diego State University, where I teach mostly classes in ethics and disability studies and bioethics. And so I'm thinking about a lot of the ways in which disabled people face discrimination and different kinds of challenges broadly, but specifically in the medical system in various ways, when they either need to get some kind of treatment for something, or even, when we talk about the kinds of technologies that are developed. So it's a wide range of stuff that I teach and sometimes write about. And so I'm super excited to be here. I also have a background in other kinds of less kind of ivory tower activism. I worked for a little while as an advocate for Disability Rights Texas, the protection and advocacy agency in the state of Texas while I was living there. And I also did some nonviolent direct action with the group ADAPT, which some folks might have heard of before, which is a group that focuses on getting people out of institutions like nursing homes and into the community. And what else? I've been involved with Little People of America for pretty much all my life, and a while ago, I haven't in a while, but a while ago, I was pretty involved in some of their advocacy efforts with their advocacy committee, and worked on things like dwarf tossing and I don't know what else. Just different people would say bigoted things in the media that we would respond to in various ways. So there's that that background as well. And as far as my personal life goes, I have a awesome spouse, Leah, who is also a little person, and 2 children. One is Hazel, who is going to be 7 on June 2nd, but she's 6 right now. And the other one is Silas, and he will be 5 this summer, June 27th. And so we have some birthdays coming up, which if you don't have kids, you might not know, but they're very big deals. So especially at this age. So that's my biggest thing on the agenda for the coming months. But thank you for having me. I'm super excited to talk about advocacy and activism and anything else that you all want to talk about.
I love it. Yeah, we are in a birthday month. So my son's birthday is the 13th and Mouse's is the 30th. And so Mouse has been waiting for April for, since the week before April, and her birthday's the 30th. So, it's all month long, and she gets it honestly because I love birthdays. And so, it is a big deal. She is going to be 9. She thinks she's 19.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
It's
then my
on.
son is eating me out of house and home. So just wait till Silas is bigger.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Because
he's.
did your children have the dwarfism genes?
No. Both of them are average size. They are average size kids. We just sort of did things the old-fashioned way, and that's how they turned out. And so and so yeah, they don't share either of our types of dwarfism. But we try our best to still talk about it with them, and help them understand that even if they don't have dwarfism, it's something that's going to definitely impact their lives and how they grow up. Just sort of having dwarf parents in various ways, and sometimes that'll be a challenge, sometimes that'll be a joy, and sometimes it'll be a mix. So we try to talk to them about that.
Yeah. My son is he's the only average height, and he's actually not even average height. He's above average, or taller than average, I should say, because their dad is 6'6", and so he he's always felt very defensive, and so he's now
Okay.
getting to the point where he can balance it, he can let things go. But he used to get real upset, and so it's interesting to see that kind of stuff through their eyes. Before we get too far away, I wanted to, you said a couple of things in your intro that I wanted to ask you to kind of define, because they're kind of new terms for me, and so they're probably new for some people in our audience. And you said ivory tower activism, and I think it was nonviolent group adaptation.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I said less ivory tower activism. So ivory
Yes.
tower is just what you sort of refer to activities sort of at universities, like academic stuff. So teaching in a classroom, or writing articles in academic journals that'll be read by like 4 people, or like academic books rather than like mainstream popular books. Those are sort of ivory tower activities, and sometimes it's used kind of in a almost disparaging way to say that something is ivory tower, and I kind of was doing that there a little bit. I think that the activism can include stuff that happens in academia, and I think that there's a need for activism within academia. But I worry sometimes that people get too stuck in academia, and that's something that I really try to avoid as best I can, but it's sometimes a challenge considering that's what pays my bills. And so it's something that I try to be aware of, that I'm not only trying to create change within sort of the bubble of the university, which is a really privileged place. And so what I was referring to when I said less ivory tower activism, or not ivory tower activism, was stuff that happens sort of on the ground, in the street, in the real world, so to speak. And so the term that I used was nonviolent direct action. And so nonviolent direct action is a method of activism that folks have been using for a long time. The first sort of practitioner of it that was sort of famous for it was Mahatma Gandhi. And so he used nonviolent direct action, which just means some way of doing something rather than just saying something to create change, right? It's direct action. And it's nonviolent in that it always has a commitment to not harming anyone else in any way, right? And so even if you are harmed, the idea is that you don't hit back, right? And so, of course, Martin Luther King in the United States is the most famous sort of practitioner of nonviolent direct action, but it can include things like marches or boycotts. Um, you can do sit-ins, all sorts of things that are included within nonviolent direct action. And so the group that I was doing it with was called ADAPT, which is a disability rights group that uses the tactics of nonviolent direct action, including civil disobedience, like Dr. King in his legacy. Certainly, there's different ways that Adapt has gone about it than King went about it. But the idea, I think, is trying to be replicated in as far as you go out there, you put your body on the line, you get arrested, to try to create change in various ways, but always with a strong commitment to nonviolence. And to I've seen disabled people thrown into walls and thrown face down on the ground and handcuffed, and all of that kind of stuff. And it's the violence that people have experienced through ADAPT hasn't been, to my knowledge anyway, sort of as widespread and as brutal as what happened to the civil rights activists of the 1960s. But that has even been a part of what ADAPT has done historically, and has been sort of subjected to.
Thank you for sharing all those definitions. Like, I'm learning things about the different acronyms and the different adaptations and the different kinds of ways to resist oppression. So in the marginalized communities, we see different forms of advocacy, and we learn about different terms such as including advocacy, and then there's activism, like you said, as well as allyship. To you, would you be able to share like the differences between each term and like what they
Sure.
mean to you?
Sure. So, I think that advocacy is probably more, it's probably a broader term than activism or allyship. I think it can mean sort of a lot of different things. It can be something that is individualized, right? You can advocate for yourself if your rights are being violated, or even if it's not like clearly a rights violation, but you're being denied something that you really need, right? Like, I would kind of argue that not having access to a bathroom is a rights violation, right? But not everybody would say that that's a rights violation, I guess. But you definitely would say that that's something that you need. And so you can advocate for yourself for that, right? You can sort of say, hey, I can't go to this event if there's not a wheelchair accessible bathroom, or whatever the case may be. And so it can be sort of individualized like that, or it can be what we call systems advocacy. And that's where you don't just try to change something for yourself or for another individual, but you try to change like a whole system to be better, right? And so that's what happens when you try to make all of the bathrooms wheelchair accessible in your city or at your university or in your country, right? And so that's systems advocacy. Now, activism, I think, is one way of doing advocacy. I feel like it has sort of a meaning, and I'm kind of making this up a little bit as I go along. I'm not really an authority on these definitions, but I feel like it has sort of more force behind it, right? Like if you're an activist, you use tactics that are, I guess, they're kinds of advocacy, but they're sort of shake things up more, I guess, right? You're trying to not necessarily work within the system all the time. You're trying to rock the boat if you have to in order to get things done. And so I think the root of activism is active, like you're acting. You're not just sort of talking or asking nicely, you're acting, right? And so that's kind of what I think of when I hear activism, that you're doing what needs to be done in order to create change. And so sometimes that can be you know speaking out on Twitter or on social media to like try to raise consciousness and try to get people thinking about these issues in ways that they hadn't thought of before. Or it can include like writing a blog post, right? And so I don't mean that you have to be like, in order to be an activist, you have to be like getting, arrested in a direct action or something, right? I just mean that it's sort of trying to shake the system up in a way that advocacy doesn't always. And so, however you sort of rock the boat, if you're rocking it, I think you're kind of an activist, right? Um,
Mhm.
so, and then the last one that you asked about was allyship. And so I think that one a lot of times has to do with your identity. And so um, if you are trying to change something that affects you personally, then you probably aren't an ally, right? I mean, I guess you could be like an ally to yourself, but that'd be kind of weird. Um, and so, like when I do, when I do like activism around disability rights that focuses on like other people that use wheelchairs, I use a power wheelchair, right? Then I probably am not really rightly considered an ally, right? Because in that context, even if I'm doing like systems advocacy and not individual advocacy, I'm still kind of doing it for people like me and who I identify with, right? But if I were to like go to a Black Lives Matter march, right? I'm a white guy. And so going to a Black Lives Matter march, I don't experience racialized oppression. And, I'm probably like the least likely person to ever be, brutalized by a police officer because of my white privilege and my disability and sort of the ways that mix. And so I think that, that would mean that I was trying to act like an ally. And I don't think just like showing up to a march or something makes you an ally, by the way. But I think that that's the idea that you're trying to create change for a group of people that you don't identify as part of is what makes you an ally. And then there's actually another term that I think is related that I might mention, and that's accomplice. Some
Oh,
people try to make the distinction between an ally and an accomplice. And so um, accomplice is like an ally in as far as you're working for change where you don't like identify with the group that would benefit from that change directly, right? But you're taking bigger risks, right? And so if you're an accomplice and you try to help a group that you don't directly sort of identify with, you're putting yourself in the line more than if you're just sort of an ally, so to speak. And so there's some folks that sort of are really kind of distrustful of the people that identify as allies. And they say, we
mm,
don't want allies, we want accomplices. We want people that take
mm.
risks with us and like really, really get down.
That's interesting. I hadn't really heard accomplice, but that makes sense. You don't want, don't talk about it. We want you to be about it. So I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned the difference between advocacy for yourself and systems advocacy. You having the level of education you do, and then being in that world, I'm sure have had to do a little of both. So would you mind, sharing maybe a situation or two or scenario or what have you that has happened, and how you decided to stand up for yourself? Was it a decision? Did you just know automatically I'm going to do it, or did you have to talk yourself into it?
Mm-hmm. Let me think of a good example of individual advocacy. I'll be honest, I'm like really bad at individual advocacy. It's hard for me. Like
Yeah.
I have an easier time doing like abstract systems advocacy, right? Like I have an easier time trying to change a law and going to a senator's office and like doing a sit-in and having the cops show up. I actually have an easier time with that than trying to like ask my employer to put an accessible door in my office, which is really absurd, right?
Yeah,
It's really
yeah,
absurd.
it's so much
Um,
easier to advocate for others than to advocate for yourselves, right? That's
yeah,
a real thing.
yeah. And I think a lot of it is like internalized shame, right? And just sort of the way that you think about, well, this is just for me and I don't really deserve it, right? And so I can kind of like indirectly answer your question, Angela, by saying like, um, I haven't really figured it out yet, right? Like I'm still working on it. But there definitely are some times that I've had to advocate for myself individually. I don't want to say that I've gotten to where I am with never advocating for myself. Sometimes it's a matter of knowing what the law says and having the ability to utilize that and leverage that to get what you need. Um, for instance, this is kind of a silly example, but I live in San Diego where like uh, housing expenses are just like off the wall, super expensive. And so
Mhm.
we don't have like enough storage in the place that we rent because it's a smaller place and we don't have a garage and all that kind of thing. And so we have a storage unit. And so when we were looking to get a storage unit, once we had our first child, and or actually our second child, and we were looking to move into a bigger place and trying to figure out like what to do with all of this stuff that we don't have room for anymore. We were calling around, and one of the places that we called said, well, we have two types of storage units. There's the first floor ones, and they're at this price, and then there's the second floor ones, and they're at this price. And so I said, well, I use a wheelchair, and so I can't get up steps. Do you have an elevator? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, I'm gonna need a first floor storage unit, but at the same low price as the second
Mhm.
floor storage unit, because you can't legally charge me for the same service, but that's accessible. You can't, charge me more just because it's accessible.
Right.
And they're like, oh, no, we can't do that. And so I said, okay, well, let me talk to your manager. And so we had a nice conversation about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the fact that, they would be breaking the law if they were to charge me more for the same service, but that was the only difference, it being accessible to my wheelchair. And so finally they said, okay, we'll give you the first floor storage unit at the lower price that we offered for the second floor storage unit. And so sometimes it sort of looks like that, right? Um,
Mhm.
and usually the thing that gets me to do it is because I get kind of annoyed at how blatant it is, right? And I think that's like the big difference, right? Like asking for like an accommodation at work might be hard because you think, well, it's only me who needs it, and it's not like a super blatant example of discrimination. Like, it's not their fault that they didn't build the building in the right way so that my office was as accessible as it should be. Whereas, like, if somebody's telling you, oh, you can only have a storage unit, but we're going to actually, you know, on the first floor, if we charge you more, then that feels more like a direct form of discrimination that's like more in your face. And so I think that's when I have an easier time doing self-advocacy.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's easier for us to do for others. And then when I think you nailed it when you talked about the shame. You know, we as people with disabilities tend to be hyper independent because we have to ask for so much help that we don't want to. Nobody wants to. And so we do everything that we possibly can. And so with that comes shame and having to say, like, give up and admit defeat and say, okay, I actually need help with this thing. And so you know, I mail a lot of stuff out, and I have a post office nearby. And you know, post office is a federal building, and you kind of expect ADA, which is a federal law, to be followed closely. And I couldn't reach the credit card machine, you know, for years. And I just would, you know, put my card up there, and then, you know, and with the post office, they put the address on the credit card machine, and you're supposed to confirm that that address is right. Well, I can't confirm that because I can't see that screen. And I always had the same person, and she clearly hated her job, like, a lot, and enjoyed making it difficult, not caring that I was struggling, and would even be frustrated because when she would ask a question about the address and I wouldn't be able to answer it because I couldn't see the screen, right? And then looking back, though, like, it was microaggressions, and I didn't see it at the time because it was a little bit each time, you know. And because the shame that's already ingrained, I didn't speak up and stand up for myself. Now, had I seen somebody else is going on, I probably would have, right? But then I went in there with a friend of mine who's average height, and I was like, I was in the car, we were riding together, running errands, and so I was like, oh, I hope that lady's not there, you know. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, God, she's just awful, like, she's not very nice and all this stuff. And she was like, okay. So she went in with me, right? And so same scenario as usual happens where I can't see the card. And so my friend is like, you know, she can't see this, she can't use this, you know, there's ADA laws that this is, you know, this is a federal building, you know. It's like she was the one pointing this out. And then the lady goes on to say, well, these are new machines and I can't move them. And that is what set me off, because for the longest I thought, it's not her fault, it's not her fault, it's not her fault. Well, this is probably 4 years now I've been going to this post office, and she said these were new machines. And I said, so you mean to tell me these are new machines and you didn't say, hey, we have a regular customer that needs access to these machines? Because previously it was, I can't help it because the machines are the way they are, and they've been that way for years. Now you have new machines and you didn't bother to stand up for me, like that. And so then I went up the ladder and I got what I needed. And now when I go in there, I get treated like a queen. But that's not the point of it. You know, like, you know, the point of it was, you know, was that it took that for me to finally stand up for myself, you know, but not anymore. Like, that was a lesson for me. And because in the end, even though it's so much easier for us to advocate for others, my sister used to say, when I advocate for myself, I am advocating for others. And I'm like, okay, you're right.
That's very wise. You know, Angela, one thing you said that really resonated strongly with me is when you talked about it, you know, not being you know, accessible, and it kind of being a choice that they made for it not to be accessible, right? They could have, when they got the new machines, installed ones that were going to be accessible to you, right? And so a lot of times people think about sort of structural discrimination, whether you're talking about structural racism or structural ableism or whatever as just sort of how things are, right? Nobody chose to create this kind of oppressive situation that sort of makes life more difficult for you. It's just how things are, right? It's part of the structure. Well, somebody created that structure.
Right.
Somebody created that structure at some point. And,
Mhm.
they maybe should have known better. And so, you have a very clear situation here in which, what is, structural as far as the
Mhm.
discrimination you were facing was a choice, right? It's a choice that somebody made to create that kind of structure.
Mhm.
And so as we're talking, I'm thinking about other situations that I had been in. Maybe I can use to explain a little bit more what I mean by structural discrimination or structural ableism, right? So ableism is just the term that you use um, to describe the ways that people are disadvantaged or discriminated against because of their disability. Okay. And it can either be sort of really overt, where somebody is tells you you're not allowed in here with your wheelchair because you're a fire hazard or something, right? And that's sort of a kind of real overt discrimination. But then there can also
And for our
be,
audience, that can happen. Like
oh
that,
yeah,
yeah, like that is a thing.
yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or it can also be structural, meaning that it's sort of baked into the structures around us. Like it's actually like built in, the disadvantage. Okay. And so to give another example um, of an actual physical structure that's sort of was discriminatory against me was when I first started teaching, the first class that I ever taught. I went to school at Michigan State University. Go Spartans, go green. Um, and I showed up to teach my first class while I was in graduate school. And I just went to the room that was assigned, and it was one of these auditorium style uh, rooms, right? And it wasn't a huge class. I think there's only like 20 students in it, but it was still in a pretty big auditorium style kind of room. And there were, you went in at the back, and so you were kind of like at the top of the stadium seating, kind of like a movie theater where it like slopes down toward the front. And at the top, there was wheelchair accessible spots with like little tables that people could pull up to if you were a student. So you could sort of sit and listen to the lecture of whoever's, teaching at the front of the classroom. And so, but at the front of the classroom, there was the podium where the professor or the instructor would, situate themselves to teach the class. But there was no access to the podium. It was all steps from the entrance to the podium. And what was really interesting, and I write about this actually in a couple different um, academic papers that I've written. What's interesting to me about this is how there is a pattern that you can pick out where accessibility for disabled people is reserved for places that we are going to be sort of submissive and not have authority,
Mm.
right? So, it's the thought is, the student may be disabled and can, so we should have some access for the disabled student so that they can sit at the back of the auditorium and, take notes and listen to the lecture. But goodness, you'd never have a disabled instructor. There's no need to have a accessible space in a position of authority because people like that don't have authority, right?
They won't expect us to be in those roles because they
Think
don't
about
think that will have those opportunities, or will like speaking opportunities. Like I did this like huge presentation, like I was like a keynote speaker, and I had to specifically ask for a ramp for the stage because a ramp is not standard. You have to still ask. And even in these award shows, like the Emmys or the Oscars, people are getting older. People will want a ramp because when you're wearing dresses and high heels, like a ramp will like they will be grateful for, but no one puts it in. It's like somewhere hiding somewhere. But
Exactly.
it's that idea, like you said, that they don't think people with disabilities, people using wheelchairs won't be up there.
Exactly. And so the discrimination, the attitude is built into the structure. And so that's what makes it structural ableism. Think about churches, right? How many times have you gone to a church and you have, maybe some pews that are removed so that someone can sit and worship and, and listen to the minister or the priest or the rabbi or whoever. But, when it comes to the position of authority, right? The discriminatory attitude is, well, people like that don't have authority, right? They don't have spiritual authority. They don't have knowledge to share.
Man, we could talk forever.
Absolutely. Because like I have stories, about my travel and discrimination where I had to like get the ADA to like support me, and like and it's just, oh my gosh. And accessibility, it's like, why isn't this is 2023, like why is this still a conversation? Why are we still struggling? Like why like do we have to get these basic amenities just to even get in the door, let alone having a seat at the table, letting alone having our thoughts and opinions considered for decision making? Like we are still trying to get in the door.
Exactly.
Literally.
Exactly.
Well, I hate that we're wrapping up so soon, but I want to tie it all back and like with one final question, Joe, for you is, what can people think about as far as being advocates for disabled people, being advocates for the marginalized communities, and how can they be more aware of the ADA? Because it's such a federal law, but people still think that they can discriminate, that they can be oppressive because it's so baked. Like you said, there are still instances that I face, like we'll face daily, that they don't realize they're being ableist when they are. People may think that they're being helpful, but they're actually being harmful. And like that's one angle to look at. And obviously, like what final words do you have for people for people that want to be advocates, that people that want to be allies, but also make sure that they're aware of the ADA and what they can't do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I'm gonna answer this kind of. I'll give a short answer and then a long answer. So I'll answer the question that you asked, and then I'll answer another question that I want to talk about. So, your first question, I think that the most important thing you can do is know your rights as a self advocate, right? But also try to know sort of what other disabled people need and are entitled to, right? And so when we first started this podcast, right, there was this conversation about how to start the captions, right? And I don't know either of you all that well, but I don't think any of us directly need the captions, right? Like we are, I think, hearing at least adequately. And so aren't, folks that need captions in order to be able to participate in this conversation, right? But understanding, the disability rights framework in a way that's cross disability rights, right? That doesn't just think about access as far as, well, I'm a wheelchair user, and so I'm going to advocate around ramps, and I'm going to know all of the laws around how wide a doorway has to be and what a slope needs to look like on a ramp and so on and so forth, right? I'm also going to educate myself about the ways that people are entitled to sign language interpreters, or different kinds of assistive technologies. And so that would be one thing, is to just sort of know what the law actually says. Um, Another thing is to try to be the change, right? I'm a university instructor, and I have to say I haven't always done the best job that I could do in my own classroom when it comes to access, right? And so I've had to educate myself about people with different learning styles, and universal design within a classroom setting, so that way my students that have disabilities that I don't experience have an equal playing field when they come into my classroom, right? And so it's not just about sort of trying to get others to change their behavior, right? But it's also about being aware of your own behavior, even as a disabled person, and how you can sort of participate in ableist structures if you're not careful, right? Because that's what we're taught. Ableism is sort of the air that we breathe. And so we replicate it all the time. And so we have to sort of be on guard. And so, even if it's not something that we need personally, we still might be doing it to other people, right? And so that's another thing that I would say is go beyond just sort of the ADA, go beyond just sort of the legal entitlements that people have, right? Because the ADA is a powerful law and it's super important, but it's not enough and it's never going to be enough, right? Laws like that aren't going to help undocumented folks, right? Laws like that aren't going to help folks that are stuck in nursing homes and can't get out because they're poor and they don't have access to around the clock care that they can pay for out of pocket, right? Laws like that aren't going to help somebody who's deaf or autistic and Black not get shot by the cops, right? And so we have to think about the ways that ableism exists in our world that can't be solved by a law like the ADA as well. And
Mm.
really try to learn about those and see how things are interconnected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And those are the ways that are social, right? And so that means that laws are almost easier to change because you convince someone that this is what America should do, and then they do it eventually, and then now you have a reason to say now you have to do this. Well, when we're asking people to change their hearts or their thought process or their um you know just to take a moment to look outside of themselves, um, it can be much harder
Yeah.
to really connect in this day and age. With the society, the Anti-Bullying Foundation I started, my biggest hope is that is that people can see that we're more alike than we are different, and I truly
Hmm.
believe that. I truly
Hmm.
believe that we have so much more in common than we don't, and especially as Americans. And so yeah, the sooner that we can start to help people understand that just because you mean well doesn't mean that it's the right thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. No, I think you're preaching to the choir here. I think that you're absolutely right that we are more alike than we are different, and that's why the interconnectedness of all of the different kinds of oppressions is so important and so interesting, because it's like, my struggle is your struggle.
Hmm. Truly, truly, yes. Well, thank you so much, Joe. We really could go on, and we barely touched on so many things. So, we may have you back again next season to
Okay.
continue some of these conversations. But thank you so much for your time, and sharing all of your insight with us. Is there a way that you would like for people to connect with you?
Yeah,
Maybe have.
yeah, sure. I think social media is probably the best way. And so on Twitter, I am philosopher Crip. And so just the word philosopher, and then CRIP, all one word. And then on Facebook, I'm just Joe Stramondo, and so feel free to add me, as long as you don't mind seeing random pictures of my kids interspersed with some of my thoughts about activism and some of the things that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, if you enjoyed this podcast episode, then absolutely add Joe. He brings a lot of value to my timeline, that's for sure. Thank you so much, Samyuktha. Episode 1 is over.
Yeah.
And we are on to the next one. So I hope everybody has an amazing day. I love
Cool.
all of you, and I'll see you soon.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Thank you for
everyone.
everything. Yeah.